I am a male, and this happened in my early 20s. Before I start, I need to provide a little backstory. I grew up in a very sheltered environment, usually only leaving the house for grocery runs and doctor appointments. I didn't even go to school. My mother decided it was best to homeschool me. As a result of my upbringing, I was, and still am, very socially awkward, though I'm getting better. One thing I did leave the house for as a child was to compete in talent competitions. I was a pianist, and I still am, though a little rusty. I had a newspaper article published for me once to advertise a fundraising concert I was holding at my local church. I needed funds to go to a competition 1,500 miles away. In the article, the journalist recorded a quote from me. She had asked what I thought of my talent, and being a child in a Christian household, I replied, "It's not my talent, God let me borrow it." Fast forward to when I became an adult. I was eager to leave the house and get out on my own. I decided to get my commercial driver's license so I could see as much of the world as I could. Besides driving long hours and the occasional night of having trouble finding a halfway decent place to park at the end of the day, I enjoyed it. One night, I was pulling into a truck stop to park for the night. As I was taking my dog out to do his business, I passed by the truck next to mine. It had its driver's side window down, and the driver was sitting in the driver's seat. He called out to me as I passed him, complimenting that he liked my dog and asked if he was friendly. I thanked him and informed him that my dog was shy around strangers. Being that I sat in a truck all day with no human interaction, besides the occasional honk and guy flipping me off for being slow, I longed for conversation, and I told him I would be right back. A few minutes later, after putting my dog in my truck, I walked over to talk to my parking spot neighbor. We chatted for a while, him in his chair, and I standing on the top step on the side of his truck. After about 20 minutes, he asked me if I noticed that his arm had bumped mine 7 times. My arm was on top of his armrest as I clung to the side of his truck. This surprised me. I had not noticed it at all. Thinking back on it, I believe he was testing to see how situationally aware I was. I told him I had not noticed. It was cold outside, considering it was the middle of winter, so he invited me to sit in his truck to continue our conversation. This is where I should have had alarm bells ringing in my head, but growing up so sheltered, I was too trusting of people. I entered. We continued to talk, though the conversation started crossing lines, asking questions that were too personal. He was asking me stuff like, "What's your phone number? Who are your parents? What were your grandparents' full names? Where do you live?" etc. Regretfully, I answered him. Thankfully, I had the sense to at least not give him my address. We had also swapped seats during the conversation. First, he had moved to the passenger seat so I could sit in the driver's seat, but then we swapped to where I was in the passenger seat and he in the driver's seat. The conversation started to take a weird and creepy turn. After all those questions, he asked, "Did you notice that my eyes don't have any color?" His irises were black, just 2 black orbs surrounded by the white of his eyes. I later looked this up on Google. There is apparently a rare condition that causes someone's eyes to be so dark brown that they appear black. This is where I started to feel very uneasy. He started talking about my childhood, and this is where he said something that disturbed me the most. He asked, "Didn't you have a talent as a kid?" I said yes, and that I played the piano. He replied, "Wouldn't that be a lie since you only borrowed it?" I had not mentioned to him anything about that article, and the city it was from was too small to be noticed by someone who lived so far away. He lived like 2,000 miles away from my hometown. I was ready to get out of there. I was trying to think of how to excuse myself without rousing suspicions. He started trying to convince me to ride with him to his next delivery and to just leave my truck where it was, that he would bring me back the next day. I declined. He then asked if I would come visit him at his home. Again, I declined. It had been several hours, so I decided to tell him I needed to take my dog out to do his business again, so he didn't go in my truck. I exited his truck and took my dog out again, but this time when my dog was done, I went back into my truck and locked the doors. I also tilted both seats forward so it would be difficult for him if he entered my truck, buying me time if needed. The next morning, he was gone. I continued on my day relieved that I was away from him. A few hours later, he called me. "So why did you tilt your seats forward last night?" I told him it was to keep my dog from jumping on them. He continued to talk to me, though I kept my answers short this time. I blocked his number after he hung up, and later decided to change my phone number. I know I was lucky that it didn't go farther than a creepy conversation. I am more careful now about who I talk to and where I am. Be careful, everyone. Never get into a stranger's vehicle, no matter how friendly and innocent they seem. I've learned my lesson. This is a story I grew up hearing my mom tell me. I was really young when this happened, and I know for a fact it was before I was 5. I only have some foggy memory of the event, especially because my mom at the time didn't want to freak me out. Some context. First, we have family all over the country. I remember spending so much of my childhood just on road trips from state to visit family, so we know our ins and outs of traveling. Second, when I was a child, I would randomly hug strangers and tell them I loved them. I was so filled with joy and love that it just spilled over onto other people. There was basically only one stranger I never immediately latched onto the second I saw them, and this is that story. So my mom was taking me to visit some relatives while my dad was staying at home with my brothers. She had to go house sit, and in general is a better caretaker of me than my father, so it made sense that I went with her. We were driving for hours until we finally hit a rest stop and got out to use the restroom. Now there was already this guy in the parking lot, and according to my mom, it looked like he was watching everyone who was entering and leaving the rest stop. The second we got out of the car, he did too. My mom held my hand as we headed into the restroom, but immediately picked up on the fact I let go of her hand to hold her other hand, the side away from the man. Now looking back, she told me that it was clear somewhere in my tiny child brain I picked up some sign of danger because I avoided the man as much as I could and would quicken my pace to the restroom and car. I never did that with another stranger ever again. I had never blatantly avoided another adult like that. Anyways, we did our business and headed back to the car, and the man had gone back to his car and watched us leave, only to then follow us in his own car. My mom immediately realized what was going on and tried to shake him off on the highway. He wouldn't budge and tried to get as close as he could. Apparently, while doing this, a semi-truck driver noticed how frantic and off she was driving and could see her looking back at his car. He realized what was going on and drove up to her side and kind of made eye contact with her, and they were on the same page from then on out. Turns out the driver called up on his radio to other truckers and told them what was going on, and a bunch of drivers from different routes nearby came onto the same highway we were traveling on. A few minutes later, they began blocking out the guy's car and essentially trapping him away from my mother and me, as she turned onto an exit to get off the highway to another rest stop as the original truck driver followed us in. He got out and talked to my mom and told her he picked up on what was happening, asked us if we were okay, and drove with us to a Burger King and got us something to eat. We talked, and he followed us back onto the road until eventually we went our separate routes. This happened around 2 years ago. I was around 15 or 16 years old. My family was on the way to Mexico. The main point of going was for my grandfather to meet my little brother, who was about 7 at the time. Some background for those who don't know the roads in Mexico. Once you cross the border at Laredo, Texas, you either take the freeway or the toll road. The freeway is a fast pass to getting thrown off the road and off a mountain, quite literally. The road isn't wide. Big trucks hardly fit in their own lane as if they respect the yellow line in the middle. Toll roads are supposed to be the safer alternative. You pay a certain fee depending on your vehicle at different spots, and there's supposed to be federal policemen along the highway. Anyways, about 4 hours before we got to my dad's hometown, we approached a bridge with a lot of traffic, which was odd since the rest of the road hadn't been so clustered. Being from the US, we found it odd that some vehicles were driving over the white line on the right side of each lane, in the shoulder. My dad, the driver, assumed it was to give access to passing. Keep in mind, we had never driven to Mexico alone, and it had been over 8 years since we were last there. So there was an 18-wheeler, or should I say 26-wheeler, in front of us. It was like those FedEx trucks that pulled 2 short trailers at once, but this one was pulling 3 normal-sized ones. It was moving so slow, being the cause of traffic in the right lane. Since he was driving on the shoulder, my dad decided to pass him, still able to do it without crossing the yellow line into other oncoming traffic. We noticed that other cars weren't doing the same, but didn't think much about it. After a while, I looked back out the back window, trying to take a picture of the sunset. When I did this, I saw the same truck coming at us in full speed. My brothers noticed that I was staring out the window and looked back. My younger brother, 13 at the time, yelled to my dad that he needed to move. As if things couldn't get worse, there was a traffic jam in the oncoming lane, so there was no way of passing the vehicle in front of us. My mom began to panic. Her then undiagnosed anxiety was getting to her, and she was constantly turning in her seat, yelling to my dad that the truck didn't seem to be slowing down. My dad managed to calm her, and we refused to look back to build onto the anxiety. About 3 minutes later, my 7-year-old brother looked back and said the truck was tailgating us. The truck was flashing his brights at us, the driver's arm out the window, shooting us the middle finger and motioning us to pull over. As if a miracle, traffic was clearing out at an exit, and my dad managed to leave the truck behind. Around 30 minutes later, the same truck came flying past us, passing us as we were going uphill. He blared his horn and pulled into the correct lane again as a tiny white car came over the steep hill. To this day, I get chills thinking about what could have happened if my dad pulled over. Mexico is not a safe place. If you plan on traveling there, please be careful and always look at your surroundings.